Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special event on Israel's war with Hamas, What Lies Ahead. This event is brought to you by the UCLA Y&S Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center, and the Rosalinde and Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. The past month has been a truly terrible and excruciating time for all those who care about the safety of Israel and the Israeli people, all those who care about the safety of the Palestinian people, and all those who yearn for Israeli-Palestinian peace. Israelis and Palestinians alike are suffering and scared. What they have been going through touches on their deepest fears and traumas. In the face of all the heartbreaking tragedy and unrelenting violence we are witnessing, we must have compassion and empathy for all the innocent victims on both sides. Make no mistake about it, we're living through the worst period in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since at least the Second Intifada, if not since the 1948 war. What happens in the days, weeks, and months ahead will profoundly affect the lives of Israelis and Palestinians and the future of their conflict. It will also, no doubt, reverberate around the world, as we've already seen. At a time like this, when emotions are running high, it is all the more important for people to understand what's happening and why, and for people to hear clear, sober, rational, and nuanced analysis. That's what the Nazarian Center has been trying to provide to our students at UCLA, to our local community, and to our audience around the world. And that's why we're so pleased to be partnering with Israel's Haaretz newspaper, its editor-in-chief, Aluf, Benn, and many leading Haaretz journalists to bring you this special event. Before we delve into the current war between Israel and Hamas and what it may portend for the future, I just want to remind everyone of what took place in southern Israel exactly 1 month ago on October the 7th. Of course, Israelis need no reminding of this, but it does seem that many people elsewhere need to remember what happened on that dark day. Some 3,000 members of Hamas's military wing and some Gazans not formally affiliated with Hamas infiltrated Israel through the border fence, as well as by air and sea. They proceeded to massacre young people at a music festival and capture 22 civilian communities, where they went into people's homes, murdering entire families, raping women, torturing, mutilating, and decapitating people. In total, around 1,400 people were killed and more than 3,300 wounded. Around 242 people, mostly civilians, including babies, children, and elderly women, were abducted and taken to Gaza as hostages. Hamas also fired more than 3,000 rockets into Israel on that day, which was the single largest volume of incoming rockets Israel has ever faced. October the 7th was the deadliest day for Israelis in the country's history. More Israelis were killed in a single day than in any of Israel's wars or in the many previous terrorist attacks. October the 7th has been called Israel's 9/11, and I think the analogy is apt in many respects. Both events were by far the worst terrorist attacks in their country's history, and they both took place on home soil, where the country's citizens assumed the state would protect them. Both attacks left people terrorized and traumatized, fearful of a ruthless enemy, and shocked and humiliated by the fact that their enemies could carry out surprise attacks on such a horrific scale. In both cases, the enemy had been underestimated. Israel's response to October the 7th also bears some similarities with the US response to 9/11. The Bush administration declared a war on terror and then invaded Afghanistan in order to destroy al-Qaeda and topple the Taliban government that hosted it. Similarly, the Netanyahu government declared a war against Hamas and seeks to destroy it militarily and topple its government in Gaza. This war is not like the previous rounds of Israel-Hamas fighting in 2008, 2012, 2014, and 2021. The current war is already much bigger and more devastating. We are now 4 weeks into the war, and the death toll on the Palestinian side has now surpassed 10,000 people, including 4,000 children, according to Gaza's Ministry of Health. International criticism of Israel's conduct of the war is growing, and there are increasing demands for a ceasefire, or at least for a pause in the fighting, demands that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been rejecting. There are also fears that the war could escalate further, particularly if Hezbollah fully enters the fray, It's already been engaging in tit-for-tat exchanges with Israel in the north. And in the West Bank, over 100 Palestinians have been killed since October the 7th. And the tense situation there could easily escalate into a third intifada, which could spell the end of the Palestinian Authority. While the fighting continues, some of the greatest challenges of this war and the wider conflict lie ahead. What is Israel's endgame in the war beyond destroying Hamas? And is that really an achievable goal? What is Israel's exit strategy? Who will govern Gaza in the future? And what will the war mean for Israel's relations with its Arab neighbors, especially Jordan, Egypt, and the Gulf states? These are some of the thorny issues which will be discussed on our panel today, which will be moderated by Haaretz's editor-in-chief, Aluf Benn. After this panel discussion, I'll have a conversation with Haaretz's diplomatic editor, Amir Tibon, who lived with his family in one of the kibbutzim that was overrun by Hamas. He and his young family survived a long, terrible ordeal, which I will talk with him about, and we'll discuss the impact of October the 7th on Israelis and the international diplomacy going on today. We will also answer your questions, so please send them to us throughout the event. Before I turn over to Aluf, I'd just like to thank him and all of the tremendous journalists and staff at Haaretz for their partnership. I can't imagine how hard it must have been for them to do this work in the midst of a war and while rockets are still flying into Israel on a daily basis. And I want to thank our audience members, wherever you are in the world. And now, Haaretz's editor-in-chief, Aluf Benn.
Hello, and I want to thank our partners from UCLA Y&S Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. Not the best of circumstances and not the best time in Israel, but I think we can draw some early conclusions after a month of the worst catastrophe, months after the worst catastrophe in Israel's history, and the worst catastrophe of the Jewish people since the Holocaust, where 1,400 people killed in a single day, when the Israeli military, intelligence, and by and large government and society were taken by total surprise, following a long period during which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was hardly front-page news in Israel. In the past year, Israeli society was torn between Prime Minister Netanyahu and his supporters, trying to redesign Israel's judiciary, trying to redesign Israel's governance in a coup, and a large group of protesters trying to slow this process down, to stop it. During that time, time and again, the leaders of Israel's security and intelligence establishment have tried to persuade Prime Minister Netanyahu that tearing society apart will be interpreted by our enemies as a sign of weakness, and that the chances and the risk of total war, multi-front war as they called it, are much higher than ever before in many, many years. Prime Minister Netanyahu wouldn't listen. He was tied and still tied to a far-right coalition that declared on its first day in office that its main goal would be annexation of the West Bank into Israel, that declared that the Jewish people and only the Jewish people have any rights in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and did a lot to promote this. And most of the Israeli public wouldn't pay attention to what happened in the West Bank, what happened in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was seen, as former Prime Minister Bennett called it, as a nuisance. And that's why the surprise and the shock of an attack from Gaza that was, I wouldn't say the most quiet border, but relatively quiet border for a long time. Now we understand that Hamas played it quiet in order to deceive Israel into this attack. The shock was tremendous. A month later, and during which Israel has launched its own offensive into Gaza, at first only from the air, and now with the largest ground offensive that I can think of since 1982 in Israel's wars, with the aim of destroying Hamas as the ruler of Gaza, destroying Hamas as a military force facing Israel and threatening Israel, and bringing back the 240 or so kidnapped people from Gaza. So far, we've seen little progress towards achieving any or all of these aims. So we're on, as the government and the military leadership has promised us, we're on for a very long conflict, very long war. Some lessons can be told even after the first month. First of all, the Palestinian issue is once again topping the regional and to some extent even global agenda. After many, many years since the end of the Second Intifada and the Gaza disengagement in 2005, the Palestinian issue was not topping any agenda. It was pushed to the sidelines, especially after the Arab Spring revolutions at the beginning of the previous decade. Now it's back again. Now the two-state solution that was off the table for a long time, with Netanyahu pledging that he could make peace with the entire Arab world without giving anything to the Palestinians. That succeeded 3 years ago with the Abraham Accord. And now the bid was peace with Saudi Arabia, normalization with Saudi Arabia. That's also off the table by now. So the Palestinian issue is back, front and center stage, and is going to remain so in the foreseeable future, with once again strong voices calling for the two-state solution, for making the Palestinian Authority the ruler of Gaza. It's still far down the line. The Israeli far right wants to turn Gaza once again into a Jewish settlement. There have been a lot of very strong voices in Israel calling to drive the Gaza population into the Sinai as once again refugees. Clearly, there is no agreed or designed Israeli exit strategy or Israeli future plan for Gaza. There was no such plan from before, because for many, many years, Netanyahu saw Hamas as the best way to avoid a Palestinian state, which he objects, by allowing Hamas full control in Gaza, by allowing Qatar and others to fund Hamas and keep the Palestinian split between Gaza and Ramallah as the insurance policy of Israel against the Palestinian state, against the two-state solution. The other important lesson, strategic lesson, is the total dependence of Israel in the United States. For the first time, the US deployed aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines to protect Israel, and told the other adversaries of Israel to stay away from the conflict, namely Iran and Lebanon, Hezbollah. So far, beyond border skirmishes in the north, they have largely stayed out of the conflict. But the situation in the north, as well as in the south, raises another question. Would Israeli citizens come back to live along the border with Gaza? Will Israeli citizens who have been evacuated from the villages and towns along the Lebanese border move back to live there, fearing that Ridwan force, the Hezbollah ground force, can overrun their villages just as Hamas did, and this is a much stronger force than Hamas, but just as Hamas did in the south? These are very tough questions. We have almost 200,000 internal refugees now in Israel from the south and north. In the south, some of the villages have been totally destroyed, have to be rebuilt. Who would live there? Who would live in the north? These are big questions that lie ahead. And last but not least, the international reaction, which includes rise of anti-Semitism and attacks on Jews all over the world, is another aspect that we haven't seen in previous wars, and we see it now. And last but not least, so let me introduce the panelists. Our correspondent Anshel Pfeffer, who covered several wars in Israel and outside of Israel, just returned from a short visit with the ground forces in Gaza. Sheren Falah Saab, our correspondent, will discuss the situation in the Israeli Arab-Palestinian society within Israel that is squeezed between the warring sides and faces unprecedented persecution within Israeli society. And Esther Solomon, who edits the Haaretz English edition, will discuss some of the global aspects of the war as well as its influence on the Jewish communities in the diaspora. Anshel, to you. Unmute.
Hi, how are you? Aluf sent me some questions in advance, so I'll say what they are. What are the main differences between this war, which is now it's just begun its second month, and Israel's previous rounds of fighting? We've never been quite sure whether to call them wars. Israelis call them operations in Gaza, mainly the ones where Israeli troops went in on the ground in 2009 and in 2014. I think there are a number of main differences, which I both saw on the ground and have kind of got the impression from conversations with officers, both operating inside Gaza and higher-ranking officers who are directing the battle. Let's start from the very from the very bottom. The soldiers, the boots on the ground, the infantry soldiers and the tank crews who are currently in Gaza. I think that I've never seen the Israeli army so serious. And when I say serious, anybody who's spent any time in the Israeli army or around Israeli soldiers know that whatever the level of the professionalism of the Israeli army, it's also very informal. It's an army where, after basic training, soldiers are on first names with their officers. You don't usually salute an officer unless he's pretty high ranking. There's a lot of humor, a lot of cynicism in the IDF. I won't say that has totally disappeared. I did see and hear some jokes, which I can't really repeat, when I was there inside Gaza with the 401st Armored Brigade and with the Givati Infantry Brigade. But it really was much more somber, I think, than I've ever encountered Israeli soldiers. And it was a bit strange for me at first because, I'm a civilian. I've been reporting about this war, but I've been very much part of the civilian discourse of what is being said about this war in the world and in Israel, and the political discourse here. One thing that's kind of that struck me and has a number of times meeting soldiers and officers in recent days is that, unlike the rest of us who have been part of this wider discourse, Israeli soldiers and officers were called up on October 7, hours after the Hamas attack took place. They were most of them, if they were regular soldiers, most of them were on a Simchat Torah leave, or some of them were on duty in other parts of the country. The reservists were all still in civilian life, and they were all called up on October 7. And ever since, they have been inside the army on a mission. And that's been 3 weeks of training and preparations for the ground offensive, and now 10 days, actually almost 11 days now of 10 days, sorry, of fighting on the ground. And they haven't left that environment. They're still talking about the Shabbat as if that day, October 7, is still happening. They have been on this for now for a month, and that is very much the atmosphere in the army. We've already sort of hashed over and talked about the context and different ways of seeing what happened on October 7. For them, it's very clear. This is something that is still very present in their mind, and they are now on a mission to eliminate the perpetrators of those terrible things that happened on October 7. That's on the level of the soldiers that to me was my main impression. Going just a bit higher up the ranks to the field officers, the company commanders, the battalion commanders, those who were inside Gaza in 2014, so those who are a bit older remember also 2009. There it's very clear that this is a different type of war. If in 2009 and 2014, the IDF went in but didn't go all the way into Gaza City. 2009, they were on the outskirts. 2014, they barely went in 2 or 3 kilometers across the border. This time, they're all in. This time, it's clear to them that they're going all the way into the center of Gaza, where Israeli intelligence believes that the Hamas headquarters are situated. And they're using a lot more power than ever before. All the front armored, whether it's the tanks, but also the infantry, who are all now on pretty new infantry fighting vehicles, not the old kind of rickety APCs, certainly not on foot. They're all going in with what are basically tanks without the cannon on top, so the most heavy armor that is used in any military. The level of firepower at their disposal, which was big it was significant in the previous operations, is much more significant this time. The coordination that they have with the Air Force and with the Navy as well, which is also being used to shell from its ships, is much closer than it was. And
but can they achieve the goals?
Sorry?
Can all this firepower and coordination and combination achieve the stated goals of breaking Hamas and bringing back the kidnapped?
And this is where I to the third level, and this is already the much more senior officers, the colonel level and above. And when you talk to them, they've seen this before. They've been in Gaza before. They've seen how every time they had operational plans to go further in, they were stopped by the Israeli government and the pressure of the Americans and other parts of the international community. They're much more pragmatic. They understand that they haven't got all the time in the world, and at some point they'll be told stop. And that is one of the reasons why they've ratcheted it up, that they've speeded up the operational plans in the last few days, because they know that they won't have this opportunity again. They don't think that there'll be another time that there'll be any type of international legitimacy, what they call the window of legitimacy, to go in this deep. And in my conversations with the colonels and the generals, that's very much a theme. We have to achieve what we can right now in the center of Gaza City, because the next stage of the war, we won't be able to employ this level of forces on the ground, this level of firepower. And they still believe that they can achieve the goal of seriously degrading, if not destroying, the Hamas's military capabilities and at least toppling it in Gaza City. But they're also very cautious and say it all depends if we can do it quick enough before the whistle blows on opportunity. They're saying, we've never had so much power so much firepower in Gaza, and we may never have it again. And at the highest level, I think, of the IDF, you're hearing a lot of frustration about the lack of any kind of serious strategy from the government. They're not hearing, and Amir Tibon will be on soon, so he reported yesterday about how the Secretary of State, the U.S. administration and Secretary of State Blinken is not getting a clear idea from the Netanyahu government about what is Israel's exit strategy. Israel's generals aren't getting that, and they need to know that so they can also tailor the next stages of the battle. And you hear a lot of frustration from generals on that. You also hear that the IDF is sort of quietly trying to work out itself what Israel's exit strategy should be, because they need to know so they can plan accordingly. It's not their job. They're generals. This is a political question, but as we know, there is no real functioning government in Israel right now, and the generals and the IDF, as has happened in the past, have to fill the vacuum.
And what about the Israeli willingness to take risks, to be or sacrifice in this war?
One soldier said to me that he misses the days when news that one soldier had been killed was something that every Israeli felt a sense of loss, and that's no longer there. 1,400 people were killed, were murdered a month ago, and ever since, every day there's been casualties, and now we're 10 days into the ground offensive, and 34 soldiers have been killed. There is a sense that that the feeling of loss has been dulled somewhat. Not that anybody is blasé about this, certainly, but it's not. There is certainly a understanding that this is a war in which there will be many more casualties, and that's unavoidable, certainly on both sides. And I think that one officer said to me that, look, we've lost. This was a bit less than today. Today's 34. It was in the 20s when he said this to me. We've lost this number of soldiers. It's terrible, but actually, in a military standard, this is not a high casualty level for this wide scale and very intensive type of war.
the Israeli ability to sustain this level of mobilization of its reserve force, which is, I think, unprecedented. For how long can Israel sustain it economically and socially to keep all these hundreds of thousands of reservists on the ground?
Well, that's an excellent question. And once again, we're back to the lack of a government. We've all seen how inept almost all the civilian sides of this government are. Certainly the joke of a finance minister that we have, who should have at least already prepared some kind of a plan of what kind of financial resources Israel can be using to sustain this level of mobilization, and at what point. And once again, this is something you hear from the generals, more from the politicians. They're saying we already need to plan what we'll do when we'll release a big portion of these 360,000 reservists, because it's obvious that the national economy can't sustain this. But once again, they're not getting a clear plan from the government when they can say, okay, let's let 100,000 reservists go home, or whatever number. Once again, we're seeing, the IDF on October 7 was taken by surprise. There were a few hours of bewilderment and of chaos. On the day after, the IDF returned to being at its best, an efficient, well-organized fighting force. The Israeli government is still missing in action. Perhaps they were taken hostage and they're still in Gaza. But there's a big lack of real strategic guidance and directive to the military.
Thank you, Anshel. To you, Sheren. The Israeli Arab-Palestinian Society is somehow caught in the middle here, and one of the areas where this inept government has been very aggressive is in curtailing the civil rights and especially the freedom of speech of this community.
Yes. I would like to start before talking about the freedom of speech, about the voiceless victim of the war, the Arab citizens that killed in the October 7. I think that the Arab citizens who killed and didn't survive the massacre of October 7, they didn't. Some of the media didn't stress their stories enough. And one of them is Awad Darawshi. The story of Awad is tragic because he's a paramedic and ambulance driver at the music festival Hamas, and he killed at the massacre. Awad refused to evacuate the scene, and he decided to continue providing medical care for the wounded people. And he thought that speaking Arabic would help him, and unfortunately, he didn't get the chance to talk, and the terrorists killed him. Another tragical story, it's about Suhaib Razim. Suhaib also is a Palestinian from the east of Jerusalem. Suhaib also a bus driver that came to the Nova Music Festival on the morning of October 7 to collect the people who were in the festival. Unfortunately, the Hamas terrorists captured him, and his family thought that he's kidnapped. Suhaib tried to explain for the terrorists that he's a Muslim, he's speaking Arabic, and he asked the terrorists, please let me go. And in the end, they just executed him. After 12 days, the family identified his body. And I'm telling these stories, and these stories of Awad and Razan reflects the impossible situation that the Arab citizens are facing in this war. This war is very different from the previous wars because they are voiceless victims, and this is the first time I think that the victims of Hamas also Arabs, and they knew that they're Arabs. And this proves that the terror and that these terrorists didn't distinguish between Arabs and Jews, Muslims, and this is very a tragic situation. On the other hand, the the complicated identity being Israel and Arab in the state of Israel, it's very complicated because all the eyes on the Arabs, and you are immediately you are suspected, and you have to prove your responsibility being loyal to the state. Unfortunately, the last 3 weeks have been very challenging because the Israeli police, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, is cracking down on Arab citizens and arresting I think that dozens of Arab citizens have been arrested for statements they have made about the war. For example, Muhannad Taha is an influencer from Tamra, Arab village in the north of Israel. He posted a picture of children of Gaza, and this is the only thing that he posted. And after 2 or 3 hours, the policeman came to his home and arrested him, and all the social media accounts shut it down. Another thing, there's also another thing that Arab lectures was expelled. For example, Warda Saada was expelled from the K College in the Negev for sharing a post without being given her an opportunity to explain herself. I should note that many of Israeli Jews have spoken out against what is happening right now for Arabs who live in Israel. There are employees and university seniors officials speaking out against the racism and trying to defend the democratic nature of the state. But I'm not sure that we are in a not a good situation, because also we see that everyone who's talking about the war or trying to express his opinion expelled. There's also students expelled, and it's like witch hunts right now. I'm not listening. I'm not hearing you.
Sorry, I was mute. How do you assess the reaction in the wider Arab world towards the events of October 7 in Israel in particular, and the ongoing war that has happened ever since?
I didn't hear you. Can you repeat the second
Yes.
question, please?
I was asking about the attitudes and the reaction in the wider Arab world towards specifically the events of October 7 in Israel and the ongoing war.
I think that the framing of the war and the framing of the October 7 events are very different from what we are dealing now in Israel, and there's a gap. The Arab media in the Arab world, most of the Arab media are neglecting and ignoring the October 7 events that happened in Israel, and this is important because they just bring the Hamas leaders and the Hamas terrorists as holy warriors, and on the one side the massacre committed by Hamas is not mentioned at all, and I think this is only intensifies the hatred toward Israel. And the other thing that the Arab media and the Arab leaders, they are not referring the responsibility of the Hamas and its role in this war. And the main public attitude that Israel is fighting the Palestinians, and this is very wrong attitude in my opinion, and the Hamas leader trying to also frame this war toward the Palestinians. For example, the Hamas leader Khaled Mash'al has interviewed 3 or 4 days ago, and he said that October 7 paved the highway towards the removal of Israel. And he said also Russia and China can do more to help us. This is the only opportunity to abolish also American monopoly. So we now more familiar also about the Hamas leader attitudes, and the Arab media is shooting and bringing these pictures to the Arab world. And I think it's the situation is worsening because the Palestinians didn't know, not all the Palestinians did not know the truth and what happened on October 7. They just see the pictures and the videos of the hostage, and they didn't be prepared. No one asked the Palestinians if they want the war or not. Like the Israelis, they also were surprised. So I think that the framing the war is very different. There is a gap between the Western media and the Arab media, and this is a challenge that Israel have to overcome and to understand the challenges that they have to deal with.
Thank you, Sheren. Esther, how do you assess the global interplay of Israel's Gaza strategy, to the extent there is one, the Palestinian rising death toll under the Israeli offensive, and the resilience of the Western government backing or Western public opinion backing to Israel's reaction and to Israel's future of Gaza, future exit strategy in Gaza?
Well, first of all, I'd say that definitely the scale of global outrage on October the 7th was pretty significant. But from October the 8th onwards, it was clear that there was a series of hourglasses that had been placed on the table, and that they had been turned over and the sand was moving down, but at different speeds depending on which country you're talking about. Let's take the hourglasses that were moving at a slower speed. So clearly we're talking about the US in terms of the Biden administration and parts of Europe. They were very quick to offer heartfelt statements of solidarity. They backed Israel's right to respond. Their leaders visited, especially obviously quite notably Biden's visit to wartime Israel. And this was a bear hug that was partly based on values, on the right of a country to self-defense, also based on response to the atrocities of Hamas, but it was also connected to the threat of a regional escalation. So all of those diplomatic and moves and ways to speak to the Israeli public as well were also backed up by the movement of military forces and equipment. And none of this means that these countries who have remained, let's say, resilient, even in the face of the Gaza death toll, they're not immune to that death toll, but they see it as part of a wider calculus of an even greater kind of threat that they need to be on the ground to prevent. Now, within this, let's say, the resilient camp, there are also governments which are backing Israel less because of the kind of kishkas or rights reasons, but because they fit the narratives that their own governments are very wedded to. For instance, they use the Hamas attack as a story about the threat of immigration, which is what Orban does in Hungary, actually using footage of the attacks to say this is exactly why our immigration policy is so stringent. Or, for instance, in India, Modi uses it to play up the threat of Muslims writ large. Now, if we go back to the hourglass, there are other ones that are working at a much, much faster speed. They're much more sensitive to the impact of the Gaza death toll. They're far less explicit about Israel's right to self-defense, and they're mostly other countries that are calling for an immediate ceasefire, and that covers quite a lot of the world. That covers most international institutions, especially the UN. There are parts of Europe, many parts of South America, South Africa, and much of the Arab world. But even if you go back to the resilient camp, you see aspects of this playing out there too. For instance, the death toll is creating major internal splits in public opinion and within political parties, for instance, in the Democratic Party in the US, within the opposition Labour Party in the UK. And these are conflicts that are still to be played out about what their impact will be on the policies of the governments themselves. Now, even in the most resilient of the resilient countries, if we want to call them that, there is the kind of self-damage that Israel is constantly doing. Because at the one point, if leaders of these countries are talking about Israel's right to self-defense and the language of rights, they have to constantly battle more and more lunatic statements being made from inside Israel's governing coalition and the rising violence in the West Bank. So even for the strongest of the allies that Israel has right now, it's a very, very difficult it's a kind of contradictory situation that they're in.
Esther, can you discuss the implications of the war on diaspora Jews and more specifically the relationship between diaspora Jews and Israeli Jews? So
one of the main repercussions that we've seen from the war for Jewish communities around the world is a very, very major spike in anti-Semitism, and it's escalating. I'll just give you a little bit of background. Just in the first 2 weeks of the war, anti-Semitic incidents spiked by 1,300% in London alone. On US campuses, Jewish students are being protected by the police and by private security guards just to go about their everyday business. Across Europe, and we've had lots of reporting on this, Jewish parents are reconsidering sending their kids to school at all because of the abuse that they face there. In Munich, a synagogue was firebombed. In Lyon, a Jewish woman was stabbed. In Dagestan, there was nearly a pogrom against passengers on the El Al plane. And in California, a Jewish man was knocked over by a pro-Palestinian protester. And although the circumstances are still being investigated, it is considered a case of homicide. And I think perhaps the most horrifying thing is we're not really that surprised. We say Israel is at war with Hamas. So from every previous experience, we know that anti-Semitism will rise. Every time Israel goes into conflict, Jewish communities around the world see a huge spike in anti-Semitism, but there's a difference in quality and scale this time. And that change in terms of how rapid the hostility being felt is shocking many diaspora Jewish communities who are at the same time mourning friends and families here and working out at the same time how to protect themselves. And it is raising bigger and harder questions about their identity, about their societies, and about their allies. On the one hand, the Jewish communities themselves are coordinating all kinds of events in solidarity with Israel or in solidarity with the hostages. And that's perhaps reminiscent of previous rounds of conflict. But what's different, I think, for most diaspora Jews now is that they are confronting a kind of rhetoric and behavior that justifies Hamas from within spaces that they really, really felt was their home turf. without using phrases like safe spaces, but places that they felt entirely at home with, including their own neighborhoods, academic institutions, and other faith groups as well. And I would say it's not really an exaggeration to say that this is a moment of very great dissonance, fear, and alienation for a lot of diaspora Jews. And we don't really know what effects in terms of identity and in terms of politics it could have. In Israel, we often expect after a conflict or a war that there is a surge towards the right, or at least a push towards the right. But for diaspora Jews, this is a very complicated question. If they want, in order to feel safe, that they need more policing, or that there should be more limits on free speech on campuses, those kinds of demands are identified much more with the hard right. And many of them just simply don't politically feel that that's their home at all. So they're actually stuck in a quandary where they are questioning some of the deepest understandings of what they felt in terms of their safety and who is there in solidarity with them, and potential solutions that don't fit with the kind of political identity that they have. At the same time, we should mention that there is a growing and pretty fundamental chasm with smaller Jewish groups on the hard left who more or less dislike or have extreme discomfort with relating to the Hamas atrocities at all, and they much prefer to skip over October the 7th just to focus on what's happening in Gaza now.
Thank you, Esther. Back to you, Anshel. You have published a biography of Bibi Netanyahu several years ago. And clearly one of the biggest questions of what lies ahead for Israelis is the future of Netanyahu, of this government, of the political system. Are we going to see, after the war, when the reservists go back home, discharged, are we going to see a resumption of the protests, even in a more assertive and even more violent way of clashing between the supporters, Bibi, and his opponents? What will be the future?
I think that it's obvious that the protest will be renewed. Netanyahu has done nothing whatsoever to give Israelis, and it's no longer just Israelis who are in opposition to Netanyahu, it's many of those who voted for him or voted for other parties of the coalition just a year ago in the election in November the 1st. So we're just a year and a week from that election. He's given them no sense of solidarity, no sense of empathy, no sense of that he's in any way looking, having any kind of self-reckoning. And if Israel experienced in the 10 months between the government taking power and the outbreak of this war, its biggest and most prolonged period of protests ever, that was just the amuse-bouche. We're really, I think, heading for one of the most stormy periods of political unrest on the streets, around the Knesset, around Netanyahu's many houses, and the ones that he's now currently living in, which are not even on his own house. Around this it's certainly unavoidable. And since Netanyahu, as you know very well, has no the word resigned does not exist in his lexicon, and the word taking responsibility does not exist for him, then it's just unavoidable. It's going to be bigger than ever before, and it's also be interesting to see how much of his base will still remain loyal to him, because both from the polls and almost all anecdotal evidence, that base has shrunken quite significantly in the last month.
Sheren, how do you see the future of Jewish-Arab relations within Israeli society? Can they be brought back even to the very fragile So the normalcy that was there before October 7th.
You know, Aluf, as an Arab citizen, I think this is the hardest days of the Arab community. But the only thing that makes me hopeful and believing in the peace is the initiatives that started after the October 7. Together, Arabs and Jews, they are trying to help the families and also the victims of the October 7. We see a lot of initiatives in the mixed also cities like Jaffa and Haifa, and this is make me very happy and brings me hope that the things maybe will be not bad like we are facing right now. There are also a lot of organizations that trying to bring Arabs and Jews together in Israel in order to maintain the relationships that was before. And I think until also this extreme situation, most of the Arab citizens are succeeded to be integrated and trying to help Jewish people in this war. So I'm trying to be hopeful in these days.
Esther, a final word from you about the threat of fake news that we see in the global media about this war, about October 7 in particular, and with the new ownership of X, formerly Twitter, I think it spreads even wider and faster than before. Can we confront it as legacy media that is trying to report things as they happen?
Well, I think that pretty much within a microsecond, if such thing exists, of any conflict starting, the misinformation starts flowing. And because of the lack of gatekeepers on popular social media like Twitter, X, the spread is completely exponential. And we already know what the script is from the start, because we know what has happened in other relatively recent theaters of war. There are some local variations here, but this is basically what happens. The key effort in terms of most of the misinformation or conspiracy theories about this war is to belittle or outright dismiss the fact that Hamas committed atrocities. I think that that's kind of one of the clear vectors, themes of the misinformation. And that is backed up by various kinds of doctored information or just outright lies, suggesting that Israel has made up what happened or that it killed its own citizens to justify genocide in Gaza. This is basically the script of the conspiracy theories. And it's exactly the same kind of repulsive modus operandi that was used and is still being used by Russian-backed and other actors against Ukraine, saying that the massacres that Russia perpetrated, in fact, Ukraine perpetrated against its own citizens. And exactly the same thing happened in Syria as well. The pro-Assad camp, who said that the white helmets were killing civilians in order to blame Assad. So we know that this is how it works. And this time we've seen exactly that happening from the hard left all the way to the far right. The same kind of attempt to manipulate facts and inject complete falsehoods, from Mondo Weiss through Roger Waters to Jackson Hinkle, who's kind of far left, far right together. It uses the manipulation of reporting, including sadly, from Haaretz, because what the dream of any of these conspiracy theories is to take a legitimate and credible news source, cherry pick, and then manipulate the reporting in order to back a completely different thesis that they have. Part of this is kind of ideological. Nothing that Israel or Israelis can touch can ever be true because it's contaminated by Zionism. Some of it, if we want to be a bit more charitable, is an inability to hold two thoughts concurrently. That Hamas committed grave crimes and that Israel has caused massive loss of life in Gaza. The idea is that there can only be one narrative, and if Palestinians are the only victims, that is because Israel is the sole oppressor, and therefore Hamas are freedom fighters, and their acts are legitimate resistance, and anyway, they didn't really commit anything that bad anyway. But for any of this to work, you have to erase any acknowledgement of what actually happened on October the 7th. So therefore, this enormous effort to push misinformation and lies online. Now, in terms of fake news, it's a slightly different and bigger subject because there is a genuine lack of independent reporting from inside Gaza, which means that major news outlets from around the world who are in fierce competition with each other to be first are scrabbling to corroborate events that are basically fed, the information is fed to them by Hamas-run government ministries or news outlets. So that leads to all kinds of problematic and hasty decisions, as we saw in the reporting of the Al-Ahli hospital.
I want to thank my three colleagues, panelists, Esther Solomon, Sheren Falah Saab, and Anshel Pfeffer, and move on to the conversation between Dov Waxman and our diplomatic correspondent, Amir Tibon. Please.
Thank you, Aluf, and thank you everyone from Haaretz for that conversation. It was very enlightening for me, and I hope it was for all of you in the audience. So I want to welcome now my friend Amir Tibon, who is Haaretz's diplomatic correspondent, and we'll have a conversation and also answer your questions. You've been sending us some questions, so please continue to do so. We'll try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. We have about 45 minutes or so, so we will try and get through these questions for you. So Amir, welcome. Okay. I've been told that Amir is not here yet. So while we wait for Amir to join us, let me just maybe take a few questions that have come in from the audience already. So I want to, Amir will answer, I'm sure, questions about Israelis' views, how Israelis are viewing the demands for a ceasefire, the humanitarian pause. I'll talk a little bit about how things are on the American end and also what's been happening on college campuses. So one of the questions that has come in concerns, how much freedom to act does Israel have in this war, and how much time does Israel have, and whether, given U.S. support for Israel and to some extent Israel's dependence upon the U.S., whether that limits Israel's freedom of maneuver. And I think I would say, clearly the Biden administration has been, very supportive of Israel and of Israel's war, and it's emphasized strongly Israel's legitimate right to go to war, its right to self-defense, and it supports Israel's objective of defeating and destroying Hamas militarily. At the same time, I think the patience, if you like, of the Biden administration is gradually running out. The Biden administration is paying a real cost, both domestically and around the world, and especially in the Middle East, for the president's very strong support of Israel. And there's growing criticism in the United States from both the left and the right. So progressives are increasingly critical of President Biden's kind of bear hug of Netanyahu and his strong support for Israel. And they want the president to call for a ceasefire. So that's growing pressure on the left, on the left flank of the Democratic Party. And at the same time, conservatives and those on the right are of the Biden administration for its attempt to try to restrain Israel's conduct of the war. So the president is really getting it from both sides. And some recent survey data suggests that he is paying a political price for his support for Israel, particularly a survey that came out from the Arab American Institute found a major decline in support for the president among Arab American voters. And while they're a very small segment of the American electorate, they are an important segment in the key swing state of Michigan. So I think there is both a concern within the administration about the political costs of this, and especially with the next presidential election approaching, and already Biden's poll numbers are not looking good. So I think all of this adds up to Esther Solomon mentioned this, the hourglass, the sand rapidly running through the hourglass, the clock ticking on how long Israel is going to be given by the United States. Now, it's true that the Biden administration is not in the position to say, stop the war. It will be ultimately the decision of the Israeli government. But behind the scenes, I think there will be growing pressure on the Israeli government to stop the war, especially if Palestinian civilian casualties continue to mount as they are. Okay, I see that now I am joined with Amir. I want to first of all say, Amir, how glad I am, how happy I am to see you. As soon as I learned on October the 7th of what was happening, my thought immediately went to you and your family, knowing that I knew where you lived. And so, just on a personal level, it makes me very happy and relieved to see you. I hope you're doing okay. I want to begin, first of all, really to ask you, how are you doing? How are you and your family doing since October the 7th? If you could just kind of tell us a little bit about that.
Hi, Dov. It's good to see you, my friend, I have to say. And it's good to see many friends in UCLA, and I want to thank everyone who joined today. So October 7th, exactly a month ago, a day that changed my life, I have to say. I was, that morning with my family, with my wife and two daughters in what we call the safe room, which is a room in our home. Every home in the Gaza border communities in Israel has a room that is built of strong concrete and is supposed to be able to withstand direct hits by rockets, and also to be locked from inside in a way that is difficult to break and come in. And most families in our area, that's where you put children to sleep at night. So we were barricaded in our safe room for more than 10 hours with no electricity, no food, no light. And we had to stay very, very quiet because there was a Hamas cell directly outside our window trying to break into the house with the intention of killing us. I've written and spoken a lot about it, so I'm not going to go into all the details again. But since then, it's been a month. We are now being hosted very generously by Kibbutz Mishmar HaEmek, which is a community in north central Israel, not far from Haifa. They have adopted the entire Nachal Oz community, the kibbutz that I belong to. They're operating a kindergarten for our children. They're integrating our older kids from the community in the local school. And life is slowly going back to normal in a sense. I mean, we are refugees in our own country. We're not living in our home. We're living in pretty basic conditions. I'm back to work. and there's a lot of work right now, Dov, as you know. There's a lot going on the diplomatic field, which is what I cover for Haaretz. But there is one problem that persists and really keeps me up at night, which is the issue of our hostages, our kidnapped people in Gaza. There are 5 people from my own kibbutz who are currently kidnapped in Gaza. There's a 14-year-old girl and an 8-year-old girl, 2 sisters, who are in the hands of Hamas. There are 2 fathers, men in their 40s. One of them is the father of a girl that goes to kindergarten with my daughter. And there is an 84-year-old woman who has lived through so much, and I just can't bear the thought that this is how, perhaps, I don't want to go into the thoughts I have about this. I just don't want to go there. So that pain is still with us, and we're trying to manage it. That's all I can say about our own situation right now.
Maybe it is too early, and understandably, maybe too soon. Are you planning or thinking about returning? Are other displaced Israelis thinking about returning to rebuild your homes and your communities? What would it take for you to do that?
I think most of the communities along the Gaza border, people want to return home. They want to do it. They want to go back and live there. This is an area that people have an ideological attachment to. They believe it's important to be there, to mark the border with our own feet. And I share that belief, but it's not going to be easy. On the physical level, Nachal Oz, unlike other communities like Kfar Aza and Nir Oz, which has a similar name but went through a very different event on that day, and Be'eri, our community, in terms of the physical damages, it's actually not so bad. There were very few houses that were damaged completely. I mean, in my home, for example, they shot bullets through the windows and through the walls and the doors, but my home is standing. I mean, for the last 2 weeks, I've been getting messages from reserve soldiers who made it their kind of like a headquarters for their operations. And so they're in my house, they're using my laundry machine, they're using my shower. Great. So the physical damage is not the real issue. The real issue is the broken trust. Okay, you can repair a broken window, a broken door, a broken road. Can you repair broken trust? We don't trust the government, the military, and the state of Israel to protect us right now. Our level of confidence in the military on the night of October 6th, when we went to bed, was 100%. We knew that if there would be any issue, the military would be there for us. We had a contract with the state of Israel, Dov. The contract was very, very simple to understand, and both sides signed it. We protect the border. We are there marking the border with our own feet, raising our children under the threat of mortars and rockets with no Iron Dome, because we believe it's important, and the state believes it's important. And so we protect the border, and the state of Israel protects us. At a time of need, the military, the government, they will be there. And that contract was obviously broken by the state of Israel on the morning of October 7. We held our side of the bargain heroically for years. We've been living there under the threat of mortars and rockets, raising our children, sometimes in difficult conditions, having to teach them from a very young age what is an alarm and how do you run to find shelter. We held our part, but the state of Israel was not there for us. And so the question is not if we are going back, the question is how are we going back? What would we demand of the state, of the military? And there's another component. There need to be people that we can trust. So if if there's a top military commander or a leading political leader who looks me in the eye and says, it's safe now, you can go back home, you can put your kids back to bed in Nachal Oz, I need to trust them. I don't really trust the current cast of characters. So it's a complicated question, but the short answer is yes, we want to go back.
Yeah, that question of trust is completely understandable, given, as you said, the kind of abject failure of the state to protect you and your family and others on October the 7th. I wonder, how you make sense of that. We had a question from the audience which was asking about why it took the IDF so long. I mean, in your case, you were rescued by your own father, who came down, you know, he's no longer in uniform and performed a kind of miracle. You must have wondered in those long, terrible hours, where was the IDF? Why did it take so long? How have you been able to gain any sort of explanation that makes sense of why it took so long for the IDF to reach you and other communities, and just why there was this startling and stunning failure on the part of the state to protect you?
It's a great question, Dov. So I'll start by saying that in the case of Nahal Oz, and this is true for many communities, there was no military that day. There were brave soldiers who eventually came and fought and saved us. There were brave policemen who were stationed in our kibbutz because they were handling this issue of the protests along the border fence for the last 2 weeks. A unit of, I think, 11 young police fighters who were there that day and participated in the battle. There were several very, very brave members of the kibbutz security team. One of them, my next door neighbor, died in battle. And they fought heroically. And there was also my father who arrived, and that story has become very famous. I'm not going to go into it. So there were a lot of brave people who were fighting and risking their lives, and some of them died. There was no military, there was no state, there was no command. Okay, the military was caught completely by surprise. The terrorists were able to overrun several of the most important bases in our area. And in a lot of communities, what happened is that when there were finally soldiers who had managed to group and arrive, they were waiting for orders that never came, because the command center itself was under attack and could not handle the situation. I can tell you that in the morning hours, there was a group of, I think, 6 combat soldiers from the Special Forces unit that made their way toward our kibbutz. And along the road, they were ambushed by a Hamas cell, and a gunfire erupted. They managed to kill and injure many of the Hamas fighters, and within their own force, 3 of the soldiers died, and the 2 others were severely wounded. And later, when my father arrived, he arrived at the scene of the same ambush, and he helped those who were wounded finish the fight and kill the terrorists. Now, these soldiers did not wait for orders. This was a very small and brave group of fighters who understood what was going on. Their commander understood that now was not the time to wait for the headquarters. Now was the time to try to save people. And just by trying to break through and attracting some of the terrorists' fire and engaging in a battle and killing and injuring them, they did something very important. Unfortunately, in many other places, people were waiting for orders that did not arrive. Now, on the broader level, this will be a shorter answer. Israel, a few years ago, completed the underground wall that was supposed to protect us from Hamas's tunnels that they were digging from Gaza underground into Israel. And once that underground wall was completed, Netanyahu celebrated it, and the heads of the military celebrated it, and they all basically sent a message to the lower ranks that there was no longer a threat of infiltration along the Gaza border, because we have the underground wall, they cannot use tunnels anymore. And they began to remove forces from our area and to remove resources from our area. When I came to live in Nahal Oz in 2014, right after the war of that year between Israel and Hamas, there was a permanent presence of 20 combat soldiers inside our kibbutz. And it was not just in Nahal Oz, but in many communities along the border. Once the underground wall was complete, the government and the military said, we don't need these soldiers there anymore. We're sending them somewhere else. Most of them went to the West Bank because that was the hottest scene at the time with, attacks and fighting. And on that morning, in most communities, there were no soldiers. And Hamas put ambushes on the road and killed the first brave soldiers who tried to arrive. And the other soldiers many times waited for orders that never came. And that's how you reach a situation where a community is under a massacre for 8 hours and the military doesn't come.
It sounds a bit like reminds me of the Maginot Line in
100%. 100%.
Bar-Lev line in 1973. You mentioned the hostages, believe now 242, I think, maybe even more.
Yep.
And you talked also about the question of trust and the trust in the state. And obviously, one element of the public discourse in Israel today is the need for the state to rescue, to bring those hostages home. That's also an element of the state's contract with its citizens, that if Israelis and the vast majority of these hostages are civilians, that government, the state, has an obligation to bring them home. How do you and other Israelis kind of see the need to do that when balanced with the need to prosecute this war against Hamas? And, the tension between does the public believe that these goals are to free the hostages and to defeat Hamas are compatible, or is there a change, a shift in terms of how Israelis are seeing the continuation of the war and the fate of the hostages?
People say that you can achieve both, but of course it's very, very difficult, extremely difficult, because in order to release the hostages, Hamas will ask for a prisoner release and it will ask for a ceasefire. That's really the only way you can get them out. You can talk about the details, okay, how many prisoners you release, how long of a ceasefire, but that is what Hamas will demand. And of course, these two actions will give Hamas a moral boost and time to regroup and will make the fighting more difficult. I believe that this is an impossible choice. Okay, we don't have good choices here. We're not in a situation where we have good choices. We're deliberating between different options. No, we have terrible choices in front of us.
Israel, I think choices in front of it.
This is war. I think the release of the hostages is more important than anything else right now. And if it will prolong the war and make me a refugee in my own country for a longer period of time, because we will not be able to go back home because the war is still ongoing, I'm not a hesitation in my mind. I'm willing to take it. We want our people back. We want the women, the children, the fathers, the brothers, everyone, okay? So if there's a chance to release them, I think this is the first obligation of the state, to protect its own citizens. You have more than 200 citizens in the hands of the enemy. If there's a chance to release them, and here I think, sadly, I've found it more useful to appeal to foreign governments, I have to say. Dov, I had a chance to meet President Biden 2 weeks ago. I wrote about it in Haaretz. He came to Israel. He invited 12 Israelis who were impacted by the war in a personal way to meet with him. I was chosen. I had the honor to be one of them. And I had a very brief opportunity to speak with him. He gave each one of us 2 minutes, which is a lot, I think, for a president of the United States. And what I told him, I said, Mr. President, you're a grandfather. Right now in Gaza, there is a 14-year-old girl and an 8-year-old girl from my community in the hands of these terrorists. We have to get them back. And I said, your friend John McCain survived 5 years in the Vietnamese prison. We cannot let these girls stay there for 5 years. We really need to get them out. And President Biden looks me in the eye. He said, I'm really, really working on it. And a few days later, I have to say, 2 hostages who are American citizens who were taken in my kibbutz in Nachal Oz. They are the daughter and granddaughter of one of the founding members of our community. They were released thanks to American mediation with Qatar. I hope the American government will do more to release these people. Use every diplomatic tool at your disposal. Qatar, Egypt, whoever you can talk to. I understand it will not be an easy choice. It may prolong the war. I will be one of the people affected by the prolonging of the war. It's not even a consideration. I mean, if we can get them out, that's the most important thing.
Do you think so? One of the what the Biden administration is currently pushing for is a humanitarian pause, to give some time for these hostage negotiations to go on, in order to try to release more of the hostages, if not all of them. Do you think, so far, Prime Minister Netanyahu has rejected that? He adamantly rejected it when he met with Secretary of State Blinken over the weekend. He seems to be maybe somewhat shifting his tone over the last 24 hours. Do you think there would be support among the Israeli public for a kind of humanitarian pause in order, if for no other reason, than to help secure the release of the hostages?
Yeah, I think it must be part of the deal. I mean, if you're doing a humanitarian pause, ceasefire, however you want to call it, Israel must get hostages. Hopefully all of them, realistically, at least a significant amount of them. That has to be part of the deal. Otherwise, it will just not. There will be no public support. I mean, listen, you talk to me, okay? I'm extremely critical of this government. I expect the members of Knesset Likud to depose, get rid of Netanyahu today, not to wait until the end of the war. He's the Neville Chamberlain of Israel. We need to get rid of him today. He's damaging the country in the middle of the war with his petty politics. But on this issue, specifically, I agree with the government line. I think no humanitarian pause makes sense for Israel if we're not getting hostages as part of it.
And what about the idea of a ceasefire, which is also becoming obviously growing international demand?
So I think obviously, that from the Israeli point of view, there should be some kind of a calculator of, how long the pause in the fighting versus how many people we get out. I think this is the only way to look at it, because that's the only thing Israel gets out of the ceasefire right now is the hostages. We don't get anything outside of it. I mean, the military clearly has momentum. Even though it's been very hard, we've lost a lot of soldiers and commanders and really some of our best people. But you see that they're moving. You see that they're getting into Gaza City. They're dismantling infrastructures of Hamas. What Israel gets out of a ceasefire is only the hostages. And that has to be part of it, I think.
So we have a question from the audience. You mentioned the Netanyahu and your criticism of him and the way in which he's put his own political interests and his own political survival before the interests of the country. So one of the questions from the audience, do you think if Israel today had a Prime Minister Gantz, for example, do you think the conduct of this war and maybe the goals of the war would be different? Would a different government behave differently in the aftermath of October 7th?
I think the aggressiveness, if you will, of the military would have been the same, if not even more, because perhaps a prime minister who is not tainted by his alliance with the far-right extremists and has not burned all of his credit with Democrats in the United States, perhaps such a prime minister would have had more support to go even harder after Hamas. That is the first point I want to make. Second point, I think such a prime minister would have had a more unifying effect on the people of Israel. Netanyahu is the most divisive figure in Israeli politics today. Half the country simply does not trust a word that comes out of his mouth. It's been a month of fighting. He's not met people from the Gaza border communities, just hasn't met any of us. He's not met, families who lost sons and daughters in the fighting, soldiers. He's not gone to funerals. And he's not going because he's afraid of public criticism. He's busy most of the day preparing for a future investigative committee that will be set up after the war to analyze what happened here. He's preparing for that. He's doing his usual media spin game to try to put the blame on others. You mentioned Benny Gantz. I personally would actually have preferred someone else from his party to be the prime minister, someone who is less connected to this overall failure, because Gantz, it's important to understand, was defense minister in the previous government and in the government before that, okay? He was defense minister of Netanyahu and then of Bennett. So even though the last time he was in executive office was a year ago, that is still, that still connects him to some degree to what happened. There are other people, Gadi Eisenkot, the former chief of staff of the military, he has not held a high-ranking office since, I think, the year 2018. That is a longer period of time, and I think you have to be a little more creative to try to tie him to what happened on October 7th. And there are other people in the political arena, but I certainly think Netanyahu, this is on him, okay? This is his failure, and people don't trust him.
I've seen, you mentioned the issue of trust. I saw a survey that just came out actually today, the Peace Index survey. And it's an annual survey conducted, as you know, among Israelis, both Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis. And you know, one of the things that was remarkable in that was that at least among the coalition voters, you know, there's still some support for him. I mean, certainly he lost support among, he never had it to begin with, but he's really created among the Israelis in general. But I'm wondering, you know, he is, of course, the great survivor. He's been counted out many times before. How long he can cling on for, because the nature of Israel's parliamentary system basically leaves it up to the coalition itself to really decide, you know, when or whether there'll be elections. So do you think that this government and Prime Minister Netanyahu in particular can cling on for not just the next few days or weeks, but even well beyond that?
I don't want to make predictions about the future, though, but I can tell you one thing. The people who led the protest movement against Netanyahu in the last few months when he tried to dismantle the judiciary instead of preparing Israel for this war, most of them are now fighting. They are in uniform in the reserve forces in the north and in the south. People from our area, the Gaza border area, had a very active presence in the protest movement. We are now refugees in our own country. We're busy building our own lives. But this is not going to last forever. At some point, people will come back home from the reserve service. You know, the country is not going to be able to function economically like this for you know, too long. And there will be a protest movement against him that will make everything we saw in the last few months look like, you know, like a kiddie game, okay? I mean, it will be a joke compared to what is coming. The anger, the disappointment, the abandonment, and by the way, we're not just talking about October 7, we're talking about everything that has happened since October 7. You just look at failure after failure of the state and the institutions to take care of these refugees in our own country. You know, people from the south and the north who are relying on the good heart and the solidarity of the amazing people of Israel. I mean, what we discovered in this last month is that we have a shameful government, but we have an amazing people. The people of Israel have really stood up to the moment. Communities are hosting people from all over the country. People just want to help in any way they can and support and volunteer. That's the good part of the story. But as for the government, you know, when people will start to come back, they're going to feel the heat.
So I want to kind of broaden out to thinking about the Israeli public opinion at the moment. And I mentioned this Peace Index survey, which just came out. It's interesting because this was a survey that was conducted about 2.5 weeks after October the 7th. And since it's a monthly survey, we can compare the results from the September survey. And what this survey found was a dramatic decrease in the willingness of Israeli Jews to negotiate peace with the Palestinians. Support for negotiations among Israeli Jews declined from 48% in September to just 25%. So just 1 in 4 Israeli Jews now support negotiations. Belief that the negotiations would result in peace has almost completely collapsed. It was already low to begin with at 17% among Israeli Jews in September. It's now just 8% of Jewish Israelis. And support for a two-state solution has declined by 10% to just 29%. These are the lowest figures since the Peace Index survey started in 2001. So that includes the entire period of the Second Intifada. At the same time, the survey found that there's also decline in support for the continuation of the status quo, that Israelis want a different situation, but they really don't believe in the prospect of negotiations. At the same time, outside of Israel, I'm sure you're aware that there's a growing sense that, you know, there needs to be some sort of political solution here. Yep. The Palestinian Authority have made it clear that they won't return to Gaza if Israel is even willing for that to happen without there being a broader political. So how do you see this? Do you see this public mood in Israel as just a kind of temporary response to this profound shock and trauma? or do you see this as a shift? And what do you think, in putting your hat on as the diplomatic editor now of Haaretz, what do you think this means for the prospects of diplomacy going forward?
I think this is a natural response, because what we saw a month ago was shocking. And there was a sense of betrayal associated with it, because in some of the communities, there were people from Gaza who came in as day workers to work in agriculture and in construction. And I can tell you the communities on the border were proud to employ workers from Gaza. They were paid, more than 10 times the daily salary they would have made inside Gaza. There was one friend of mine from the kibbutz who works in the agriculture, and he was, their point of contact. He was responsible for employing them. He said, I was so proud to see the pictures in their phones of the homes they were building in Gaza from our salaries. Okay, and they would show him, the houses they're building and the children that they could, invest in education for. And in some communities, I'm not saying that, necessarily in ours, although there are suspicions, but in some communities, we know for a fact that these same people were spies for Hamas, were collecting intelligence and giving that information to Hamas to help them plan this atrocious attack. So the sense of betrayal and mistrust runs very deep. I will say, Dov, there are also other stories. There is a story that became famous in recent days about a Bedouin family from the city of Rahat that saved dozens of people from the music festival where Hamas committed a massacre. Hamas came to this music festival outside Kibbutz Re'im and slaughtered 260 people. And there was a family of Bedouins from the area. One of their cousins was there, and they helped rescue him along with dozens of other people. And I met Muhammad Darawshe, who was a longtime peace activist in Israel. His nephew was murdered in that party. He was a paramedic. He was treating injured people, and the Hamas saw him and killed him. And by the way, Hamas killed dozens of Arab citizens of Israel on that day. And the people who were on the scene said they were especially cruel to them because they saw them as traitors and collaborators. And we have now Arab doctors and nurses in the hospitals who are treating the wounded soldiers that come in from Gaza. It's a complicated picture. I do believe, at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of a joint future in this land, in this country for Jews and Arabs. But right now, it's impossible to imagine it, Dov. It's impossible to see it. It's painful, but it's impossible to see it because what happened on October 7 was a life-changing event for many people. And it will take time to think of ideas and solutions. But right now, I think the main focus, first of all, is on defeating Hamas, because without doing that, we know there will always be this extremely negative, ruthlessly violent organization that will try to do everything it can to disrupt any kind of coexistence and peace in the land. I mean, think about it. What they did with this attack, the Netanyahu government was openly discussing the possibility of enlarging the number of Palestinian day workers from Gaza who would come into Israel. I had a story about it 2 weeks before October 7th. They were talking about it in the open. This government agreed as part of the visa waiver negotiations with the US to allow the hundreds of Palestinian Americans in Gaza to have very easy entry into Israel and get a visa for 3 months. I don't know if any of that will ever happen again after October 7. I mean, the calamity that Hamas has brought on Gaza, it's even worse than what they did to us in Israel. And so this is, these are important questions, but I think it's too soon for them.
Yeah, so in a way, the already yawning divide between Jews in Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza has only widened further since October the 7th. But maybe the divide between Jewish and Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel has somewhat maybe narrowed, and because, as you said, the recognition that there was great acts of heroism by Arab citizens of Israel.
And Dov, there's also an issue of political leadership here, and there is, a political leader in Israel I want to mention, Mansour Abbas. Mansour Abbas watched the horror video that the Israeli military has assembled, showing the atrocities that Hamas committed on that day. He watched it and he later spoke, not just in the Hebrew media, but in the Arabic media, about the impression that it made of him. And he said, these are crimes. This is against the values of our religion. A member of his own party who refused to watch the video made an abhorrent statement saying, it's not as bad as people say. So he just, viciously, criticized her for it and said that she will not run in the party next time there's an election. He's not accepting her. This is the action of a leader, okay? And that makes a difference. And if there's one bright light after a month of terrible fighting in this country, it's the fact that so far we have not had an internal front like we had 3 years ago in Operation Guardian of the Walls, when you had terrible violence committed by Arab citizens of Israel, and in some cases also Jewish citizens of Israel against Arab. I mean, that is not happening right now. And after 1 month of fighting, we have to be grateful for that. Absolutely.
But Sheren did mention in her comments earlier, what the kind of repression that some Arab citizens of Israel have experienced, and there've been arrests for posting things on social media. How do you? I mean, is there a danger of what I'm a political science would call democratic backsliding?
Oh, for sure.
In this kind of repression of and could that spark the kind of Arab Jewish violence and tension that maybe some like Itamar Ben-Gvir would be only too happy to exploit?
We have to work very hard to make sure that doesn't happen. But yes, the danger is real. The danger in general of taking away democratic rights is still a real issue here in Israel. I mean, this government was adamant about doing it just a few months ago. Right now, they've been in a state of shock for a month, but they could regroup and try to do it again, and we would have to find ourselves fighting two fronts, if you will, against the Hamas that is trying to kill us and against the government that's trying to take away our rights. But at the same time, though, there is also some momentum in the opposite direction that must be considered, okay? I mean, we saw a historic event this week in the Knesset when a coalition led by, ultra-Orthodox, ultra-religious parties allowed the passage of legislation comparing the conditions of LGBT Israelis when it comes to recognizing the families of those who are kidnapped in Gaza. And even some of the ultra-Orthodox lawmakers supported this legislation. This is not something you could have imagined months ago. So there are different forces pulling Israel in different directions right now. There is, still the danger of the far-right Ben-Gvir faction. But there are also positive forces that are trying to take the country in a more sane direction right now.
How do you see, I think maybe we have time for just a couple more questions, the impact of Israeli military casualties affecting this? Because now that Israeli ground troops are inside Gaza and now have entered Gaza City, where there is intense, fighting and many dangers, there's likely to be growing Israeli military casualties. Do you see a kind of the resolve that Israelis have today continuing even in the face of mounting Israeli military casualties, or do you see, the cracks and divisions growing as military casualties escalate? I'm thinking of, the example of, for example, the war in Lebanon in the early 80s, and how, there was initially public support for that, but that public, of course, that was in the aftermath of Sabra and Shatila, but, things shifted quite dramatically. How do you see the Israeli public going forward, particularly with mounting casualties on the Israeli side and, of course, on the Palestinian side?
I think right now we're still at a moment where there is a fragile consensus, okay? There is an understanding that this must be done. I've been in touch with families of soldiers who died protecting my community, and also some who later, who protected my community on that day and then later fortunately died in the fighting inside Gaza. Right now, there is a strong sense of this has to be done. This is the price to be paid. There is a sense of a sad sense of pride. I hope we can keep it, but it's very difficult to keep it over time. It's difficult because of the political divisions in the country. It's difficult because of the forces that are trying to pull the country in different directions. If at some point there will be a ceasefire, if there will be some kind of an American ultimatum, I don't know how Netanyahu will respond to it. I mean, Netanyahu owes a lot to President Biden right now. Biden, in the first 2 weeks of the war, made several interventions that were crucial to Israel and also helped Netanyahu himself politically. I mean, Netanyahu...
Not known for his gratitude, though.
Yeah, listen, this is the most selfish, egoistic man on the face of the planet. But still, I mean, Biden, he owes a lot to Biden. It's a consensus that still exists. I feel it in the street, I feel it in conversations, but it's a fragile consensus because the issues of division are slowly raising their heads again, and it will be difficult over time to keep it.
Well, I want to thank you, Amir, for sharing your story and for giving us a lot of great insights into the mood of the Israeli public at this point. And I also want to thank everyone at Haaretz again for their partnership. As I said, I know what an extraordinarily difficult time this has been for you, particularly, Amir, but and for everybody at Haaretz. And so everyone at the Nazarian Center is very grateful to be working with you and appreciate all the work you've been doing during this time. I also want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us today. I hope you found the conversation to be interesting, insightful. This will also be, the recording of this will be available on the Nazarian Center's website as well as on our YouTube channel. And so please share it with friends. And I want to finally make a quick plug for our conference with Haaretz, which we will be doing next year in March, on the 17th of March. We will be doing once again a conference with them. So I hope many of you will join us for that and save the date for that conference. And in the meantime, to continue to follow Haaretz's excellent coverage of the war and all of the events that are happening around that, both in Israel and around the world, as well as the Nazarian Center's event. So we have one coming up on the attitudes of young Americans toward Israel. There's been a lot of focus on what's been happening on college campuses in the United States, including on our own campus at UCLA. So we will be having an event soon, a panel discussion, talking about the attitudes of young Americans towards Israel, how things are shifting, and what's been happening on college campuses. So hopefully you can join us then. I want to thank Amir again. Thank you all for joining us, and be well.